and welcome to another edition of the Empathic Designer podcast by Vylearn. I am your host Vytheeshwaran. In today's episode, I'm going to talk to you about fonts. I will be answering some of the most common questions that I get during my training programs and from my clients, such as what fonts should I use for my documents and presentations? How should I select the right font? How many fonts can I use in my document? And so on. So sit back, relax, and let's get started. Before we begin, let us first look at the various types of fonts that are available to us. They are serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, fantasy, and MS fonts. Let's look at what these are. So serif fonts contain serifs, which are those small strokes that protrude from the main body of the letter. Serif fonts are easy to read in physical and in printed formats, as these serifs lead the viewer's eye from one character to the next. Times New Roman is a wonderful example of a serif font. Now, sans serif fonts do not have these serifs. Sans serif fonts are much easier to read on computer screens, and it's commonly used in online materials and in web copies. Arial is a great example of a sans serif font. Monospace refers to fonts that have equal spacing between their characters. Courier is a classic example of a monospace font. Now, cursive refers to those fonts that resemble a handwriting, and brush script MT is a classic example of a cursive font, and fantasy fonts are those which are highly stylized and decorative, and Luminary is a good example of such a font. And finally, MS stands for Microsoft and indicates that the font was created for digital devices by Microsoft, and Trebuchet MS is one good example. So any font that has a suffix MS is a font in this category. Now, go back to Microsoft Word and PowerPoint and try spending some time and identifying these font types. This will help you to take your first steps towards identifying the fonts for your documents and your presentations. Now that you have an idea of what font types are, the first step to choosing your font is an audience analysis. You will have to know your target reader to ensure that the font is appropriate for them. Always dress for the occasion. A good choice of font makes it feel so natural that your audience doesn't even think about what font you have used in your document. Now, the second step is to base your font off your brand and what it represents. Your brand's expression could range from anything being minimalistic to bold to modern to contemporary or old school, and identifying fonts that resonate with the tone of your brand goes a long way in ensuring visual consistency. While reflecting on your brand is very important, it is also important to consider the tone and the key message that you are delivering through your documents and choose your fonts appropriately. Another easy way to identify fonts for your presentation or document is by selecting fonts that have a large font family. Now, if you are a regular attendee of my training workshops, you will know how I use fonts like Arial and Railway quite extensively. Now, these fonts have a lot of variations inbuilt, and it is much easier to play around with them and create hierarchies while maintaining visual consistency. And if you are working on tight timelines, this is one of the best ways to go about it. Now, if you are creating documents that are going to be viewed in a browser or going to be distributed, it is also important to ensure that you select fonts that are web safe. Web safe fonts are a list of fonts that are typically available across operating systems and is supported by all major browsers. Now, this will ensure that your fonts and visual design remain the same and consistent across different users. So, here's a list of web safe fonts that you can use for your programs and documents. Now, one of my favorite plays with font involves creating contrast, and I use this especially on slides, posters, and banners. This helps creating a great level of visual interest and makes your slide not only look aesthetic but also professional. So how do you select fonts for this? You can literally work on infinite number of combinations here, and don't be afraid to mix font types. But when doing this, I would like to share my 4 pointers to get this right. The first is, when you're choosing your font pair, try to identify at least one common feature among them. This could be anything from the font weight to the character height to the shape of the alphabet. Just one common element, and once that is in place, the rest can be different. Now, this is going to help you create a lot of visual contrast, which immediately grabs the attention of your audience. And at the same time, please don't combine fonts that look completely different from each other, because what happens is when you do this, they often tend to clash rather than contrast. Now, the second point is that you should ensure to create a proper visual hierarchy and use one font as your main font and the second font as a support or a secondary font. Third, don't overuse this. Too much visual contrast across multiple pages or slides will also become a major source of distraction for your audience, and this drives them away from your key messaging. And finally, don't select fonts that look visually similar. When you use two different fonts that look visually similar in close proximity to each other, the output will look a little weird, and from your reader's perspective, it would seem as if the letters are somehow typeset wrongly, leading to a distraction in their minds, and they immediately lose focus. At Vylearn, I get several requests for redesigning slide decks ranging from sales pitches to training materials and handouts. And one of the standard questions that almost every one of my clients ask is, how many fonts should I use in my document? I normally recommend not more than 2 to 3 fonts across your entire document. And out of these 2 to 3 fonts, identify one font which is going to be the dominant font, the hero, which will be used at up to 85 to 90% of your document, and the remaining 10% is dedicated to your secondary fonts. And as always, don't forget your hierarchy while arranging your fonts, and this will ensure that not only you will have a good balance between creating professional documents and providing a visual relief, but you will also be able to make it that much more aesthetic and visually appealing. And as always, the secret to perfecting the art of font combinations is only through practice. Constant experimenting and practice will help you develop yourself towards identifying the right font and the right font combination for your next project. Thanks a lot for tuning into this edition of the Empathic Designer podcast. I hope you found these tips useful for your next project. And if you would like to work with me on creating your next project of professional documents and presentations for you or your organization, you can always leave a note here in the comment section below or write to me at vytheeshwaran@vylearn.com, and I would love to have a conversation with you. And as always, if you like this video, go hit the like button and the subscribe button to make sure that you are the first to get alerts when I post new content every time on my channel. Thank you and have a wonderful day.